right, thank you all for joining us. We are going to be talking about an alternative way of connecting things in the Dynamics 365 world, looking at customer engagement on the one side, which often has to connect up to Business Central or the other way around. But seeing as they are still two different applications, we have multiple ways of connecting those. Not all of them are equally obvious, and we'll talk through some of the less usual ones now. First, let's get reacquainted with the Microsoft Business Application Platform. It's so much more than just Dynamics. The Business Application Platform runs on an Azure core and is the unification of two very big products that Microsoft already has. It is Power Apps on the one side and Power BI on the other side, where Power Apps focuses a lot on making sure that we can use the data that we already have in our various applications, either inside of the Microsoft ecosystem or outside of it. And we can give that to our users to work with. We can give them processes they can work on, and we can give them all of the tools they need to do their tasks, be it in either one of the first-party apps like Business Central, or be it in one of the custom-built apps that we may create in Power Apps using all of the tools that Microsoft gives us. On the one hand, we have Power Apps itself to create custom apps, but we also have all of those other apps like Microsoft Flow to connect up different parts of the different apps that we have. And we'll look into that as well. Together, Power Apps and Power BI make up the business application platform. Dynamics, Office 365, both run on top of this platform, and standalone apps in this illustration indicates that we can also create our own apps, and we can tack those onto the Power Platform.
Michelle?
Yes.
Just a comment from the audience. Could you move closer to the microphone or something, because it's
Microsoft. If that's
getting a little bit louder, perhaps somehow.
Sure. I'll try to talk as loud as I can. The microphone is very close because it's attached to my face.
Okay.
I'll try to talk a lot louder.
Thank you.
Inside of Dynamics 365, it's already one platform, but as we all know, it's still different applications for different workloads. So we have, of course, Business Central for all of the core systems that lead all the way from, it could lead all the way from a sales opportunity into an actual order and financial transactions. But we also have specific workloads for specific tasks, like completely separate the Dynamics 365 for sales, one for field service, one for product service, customer service. We have all of these different applications targeted at different workloads. And we can connect all of those different applications and use the individual applications to leverage their respective strengths. Even though we can do sales things inside of Business Central, Dynamics 365 for sales is specifically designed for the opportunity process and the sales process. So it is a very powerful tool for us to use instead of the native sales sections inside of Business Central, for example. On the other side, in Dynamics 365 for sales, there is also order management and invoicing, but Business Central is so much better at that. So these two applications each have their strengths and some areas where they are not necessarily the best choice, but we can connect up those two worlds to make sure that each of the individual applications uses their personal strengths. Starting at a Dynamics 365 for sales perspective. In a typical Dynamics 365 for sales process, we'll start with a lead, which is essentially unqualified data or unstructured data. You get a business card from someone, or you buy a list of leads to someone, you funnel them through your Dynamics system and start calling them or start emailing them. At one point, you might qualify one of those leads or two of those leads or some of those leads. When they are qualified in Dynamics 365 for sales, that will result into an account and a contact with an opportunity process attached to it. The opportunity process is really the jumping off point for the rest of the sales process, where we start managing the customer, we start managing their expectations, and start producing an offer which we can give to them. Eventually, that might lead to a quote, which will hopefully lead to an order, and eventually, of course, to an invoice if everything goes well. Let's assume that everything does. But all of this from a Dynamics 365 for sales perspective is quite a lot, and especially those last two steps, ordering and invoicing. Even though it is inside of Dynamics 365 for sales, that's not really what the application is good at. That's where Business Central really shines. So where do you create that cutoff exactly? You could place it right after the opportunity. So as soon as something is an opportunity and you try to produce a quote, you can do that in Business Central. Maybe you place it after the quote, but before the order, maybe after the order, before the invoice. The exact configuration is really up to you if you really think about it. If we think about the native integration between sales and Business Central, or sales and NAV, which is a very similar integration, we don't have a lot of options there. We can really only work with the predefined configuration. And if we want to change any of that synchronization or any of that integration, we want to extend that into additional entities, or if we want to move one of the processes from setting the cut over between the quote and the order, for example, if we want to move that to the invoice, for example, or if we want to pull that a little forward to right after opportunity, that's not really what the standard integration gives us. So we might want to look at some custom integrations there, but without really looking at code, ideally anyway, and that's what we'll be looking at today. A little more about the sales process in Dynamics. The sales process in Dynamics 365 for sales is all based on the business process flow, as that's called. If you open up Dynamics 365 for sales, you'll see in the legacy interface that you have big green arrow blocks, or in the modern interface, you have those red dots that guide you through a business process. And each of those dots can represent an action, or it can represent a stage where you do something to move the opportunity along in the process. And we can trigger events on each of those moments in the opportunity lifecycle as well, giving it maybe a trigger to move things into Business Central from that point, or at least synchronize the information to Business Central perhaps. The business process flow designer inside of customer engagement, so on the Dynamics 365 for sales side, allows you to customize those stages entirely. You can define those stages individually and even add steps to them, and you can trigger automated processes on each of those stage transitions. Let me show you that in the application itself. We'll open up customer engagement, or Dynamics 365 for sales. And if I go over to the opportunities, on the left-hand side, I can choose opportunities. As soon as I create a new opportunity, we have that process on the top here that says what steps I should follow to complete my opportunity. So all the way from qualify. So we start by identifying who the account is, who the contact is, what the purchase timeframe is. Then we move on to developing, then we move on to proposing, and then eventually, of course, we close. And where we create that cut for moving into Business Central, for example, is completely up to us if we use some of the tools that Microsoft gives us through the Power Platform, rather than relying heavily on the standard integration. The standard integration is, of course, still a great way to synchronize accounts and contacts, or companies and contacts, or vendors and contacts. But perhaps to move across the sales process is not the most ideal integration that we have. So we can take a look at some of the other options a little later in the session. Let me switch back to some slides and let's talk about, that's the wrong button. Let's talk about modern business apps before and after the common data service. So in a traditional business apps landscape, we look a lot at different applications that are across the organization, where different people are working in different applications. And in our modern cloud atmosphere, we still have this a little bit, especially when we look at Dynamics 365 for sales is a different application than Dynamics 365 Business Central. They are still separate applications. But instead of having each of those integrations separately, so having all of the applications integrate with the individual other applications, we can now leverage the common data service to transform that landscape to make sure that we have all of that data in a central point in the common data service. And we can build new integrations, new powerful apps, and new workloads on top of that. So instead of connecting up all those organizations, we build our apps from the cloud up by making sure that all of our data originates from the common data service. One of those things that helps us to do that are Canvas apps. Canvas apps help a business power user to create custom business apps for any of the Microsoft platforms and a lot of other platforms as well, using their already existing knowledge of Excel and PowerPoint. Inside of a Canvas app, you can connect to a lot of systems that you are already using today. So if you already have data inside of Business Central or inside of a different Microsoft application like Outlook or inside of SharePoint, or even inside of a lot of other applications outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, you can connect to those data sources already today. You can create apps with forms and workflows without writing code. There's never a moment where you actually have to write code. Of course, you still can if you have that affinity, but you don't have to. You can use simple expressions, formulas like you are used to in Excel, to create your app and make it work without writing a single line of code. And these apps will work on any device as well. If you build it for mobile, it will also work on the web in a special player that you can use on the web. Or if you build it for the web, it will also run on mobile. We can build custom business apps using our existing data that will work almost immediately out of the box. All of those data sources that I'm talking about, there's literally hundreds of data sources that we can choose from. There's 200 something. I'm not exactly sure on the correct number at this moment because Microsoft is adding them almost every month. A new connection is added. We can attach these data sources to tables or galleries that we show in apps. We can connect those different data sources together as well, so they exchange data amongst themselves. And we can connect data even on-prem as well. Nothing has to be in the cloud, but everything can be in the cloud. If we're still trying to build a modern business application on top of Dynamics NAV on-prem, for example, that is also possible. We can connect to virtually any data source, be it in the cloud or be it on-premise. Let's look at an app that we built specifically for Business Central. And this is a mobile app that people use in the field every day to fix their physical inventory journals right inside of Business Central. This is an app that we built in less than a working day. That's initially a proof of concept that we devised. We built it out and a customer is using it now every day. One of our partners is now using it every day in the field to update their physical inventory journals straight inside of Business Central. Let me switch back to my browser here and let's open that app. So I have it here running on a fake iPhone and we can see a custom style has been applied to the app. So here it's our QBS group style and I can interact with this app and it pulls its data straight from Business Central. So it's pulling this straight from inside of my demo organization. It's showing the physical inventory journals, the live data that I have inside of my system. So I can see, for example, that this pair of table legs here, the quantity listed inside of Business Central is 5. As I'm walking through my warehouse, I can see that the actual quantity is not correct. There may be only 4 of those in the warehouse. So I'll just go ahead and tap that arrow, and I'll change this from 5 to 4, and I'll update that. And it goes straight, pushed into Business Central, and it's updated immediately. Let's open up that same data inside of Business Central itself. Let's open that up. Of course, I am already signed in, so I want to sign into the organization itself. That's fine. Nope, that's not what I want. Apologies. I think I'm signed into multiple accounts. Let me open up my Business Central. And here we are in Business Central. Let me open up the physical inventories. So we can see the quantities here. It has already updated this one, but let's look at another one. Over here we have a quantity of 100, for example. We have this Berlin, it's a chair. I apologize that everything is in Dutch, even though I have everything set to English. Somehow my product catalog is still partially in Dutch. So Business Central thinks that we have 100 of these chairs, but as I'm walking through my warehouse using my phone, I can see that Business Central does indeed think that we have 100 chairs, but as I am starting to count them, by the time I'm almost at 100, I notice that actually there's not 100, there's actually only 95 chairs in the warehouse. So I'll go ahead and update that quantity. And as I go into Business Central, let me just open that screen once more. I'll open the same journal again. And we can see this here. We've updated this almost immediately. It hasn't refreshed yet. Let me refresh the application once more. Or did I upload the wrong? Oh, there it is. So it takes a little bit of time. The physical inventory has now updated. You can see that we have a discrepancy of 5. And in the backend inside of Business Central, someone who is working in the office notices that this record has been changed and can then apply the corrections accordingly. While I was walking through our warehouse, updating the data straight into Business Central without actually having to drag a laptop with me, just doing everything through my iPhone. That's one side. So we can create custom apps built on top of Business Central or built on top of many other Microsoft applications and non-Microsoft applications. We can use those integrations that Microsoft already provides with us, or connectors really, as they're not really integrations because they're just connectors to the data that we already have. We're not necessarily integrating any data. Another great facet of the Power Platform is Microsoft Flow, which allows us to use all of those connections that we can use to create apps, to create our own custom integrations, to create workflows that work across applications rather than a workflow only running inside of Business Central or a workflow only running inside of SharePoint. We can have a workflow that runs across multiple apps, that pulls data from all of those apps, and that also puts data into the apps, or even involves humans inside of the workflow by giving them push notifications or approvals and decisions to make. Microsoft Flow is a completely automated service that allows you to connect to the data that you already have, much like those apps that we were looking at. You can create workflows that use triggers and actions without writing any codes or scripts. So the same power that we have inside of Power Apps, we can use all of that to create workflows that either trigger themselves automatically or we start them manually. We can edit our flows straight in the browser, so there's no need for us to download anything to create flows. And if one of our flows is misbehaving, we can even use the Microsoft Flow app on our phones to see what's going on and adjust it on the fly. And we can use approvals as well, both inside of Flow or straight from Business Central. We can ask for approval processes to run on the existing data that we have. There's a couple of types of flows to start with. You can have a scheduled flow which is essentially just a recurrence like you would have in the Windows scheduler, for example, or in a recurring appointment that you have in your Outlook. You can configure the flow to, let's say, start every day or run once a month or run every hour. You can have automated flows that trigger when something happens inside of an organization. So when a certain order gets qualified or a certain order gets filed or a lead gets qualified or something happens in the organization that you want to respond to. You can have instant flows, which are flows that you start manually and instantly by clicking a specific button. And then we also have those business process flows inside of the sales process that I showed, guided flows that will help a human through a process, although parts of that process might also be automated. In our flows, after it's been triggered, we can perform a number of actions. We can perform only one action or several actions, and the actions we perform can be across applications as well. We don't have to stay inside the same application. We can connect to any of the cloud services that Microsoft provides to us, or to any cloud service that Microsoft has created a connector for, either in the cloud itself or maybe even the on-prem variety of the same application as well. For Business Central and NAV, for example, we can connect to either an organization inside of the cloud, or we can connect to one that runs on-premise. Some of the actions that we use in our flows might not even be connectors to data. They are just manipulations that we can use inside of the flow as well. For example, we can convert a list of orders into a neat table that we can put into an email message. We can also do more advanced scenarios like calling HTTP endpoints, like the Business Central or NAV web services. We can just call those directly as well if we have some more advanced scenarios that we want to cover. And for the even more advanced scenarios, we can also create our own connectors. The standard connectors that are supplied by Microsoft for NAV require you to use the OData URLs from the standard web services. You do have to turn on the web services that you want to use, though. By default, of course, there are some web services turned on, but it might be that the particular web service you need is not turned on. So you'll need to turn that on. Inside of Flow and inside of Power Apps, you can use the same connectors for every application. So for NAV, we can use the actions that we see here. We can create items in NAV, we can delete items, get the tables, and update items as well. Inside of Business Central, there's a native integration for Business Central. So we don't have to use the web services. We don't have to use the OData URLs. We can just use our own account when we connect. It automatically connects with the current account that you are signed in with. It just uses those credentials to create the connection between Flow or Power Apps and Business Central itself. There's also considerably more actions available for Business Central, as well as a whole bunch of triggers that are available for Business Central, whereas on the NAV side, there's no specific triggers available. So we'll have to create our own triggers, like running on a particular schedule. On the Business Central side, we can see, for example, we can trigger a workflow when a customer approval is requested, or when a purchase document approval is requested, or when a particular record changes, or when it's created or deleted. And there's a whole bunch of more. There's a link in all of these slides to the exact list of connections that you can use. For Business Central on-prem, we find a scenario that's very similar to the NAV connector, because it is essentially the same connector with a few tweaks and tunes there to make it work just that much better for Business Central specifically. So let's look at some examples of flows that we might use. Let me open up Flow and go to my flows in my organization. We see that I already have a few flows, and one of them that I have is this flow, which is request for approval, for example. We can find a lot of those examples in the templates. So if we go to the templates first, and I'll just search for Business Central, we can see a whole bunch of flows ready for us, already pre-configured. All we have to do is select the right company name inside of Business Central. So most of these are targeted towards approval flows, so we can see all the different types of approval flows, and we can use any of those inside of our flows. So let's look at the one that I've already set up, and let me edit that to show you what's going on inside. So this is a flow that automatically starts itself when a purchase document approval is requested. We can see it's configured. I'll zoom in a little bit, make that easier to read. It's connected to my Cronus NL organization. The document type has to be invoice, the status has to be open, and the amount has to be at least higher than 0. What it will do after that is it'll retrieve that item from the workflow purchase documents, and then it will start a flow approval. It will send an approval message to my admin user with these details that it's pulled straight from Business Central. Whenever we click inside of any of these actions, we can use information that has been pulled from Business Central to put inside of the requests. After it's been either approved or not approved, of course, it could also be rejected, it performs one of two actions. You can see that either it runs the approve workflow inside of Business Central or it runs the reject workflow. And we can dive in more after everything has been completed. It'll use Office 365 to send an actual email. So let's give that a spin. Let me click on test here so I can use this to test my flow. I can choose the scenario. I'll perform the trigger action to make sure that the flow will stop and wait for this event to happen. So let's go back to Business Central and let's make that happen. Let's go over to purchase invoices. And let's grab one of these invoices. And I'll go to request approval and send an approval request. While that is running, I'll jump back to flow. And we'll see that it's triggered this flow. It has retrieved the item, and we can see exactly what's happening there. So we can see it's used this organization or this company, this table name. This is the record number for that record. And we can see the entire details of that record. We can see which vendor that is, what the item number is. You can see all of the details right here inside of flow. And we can see now it has landed inside of the approval step. That means it's going to send an approval to my email. Let me open up Outlook, and we can see that approval appearing here. This is what an approval looks like when it arrives in your inbox. It's pulled all of those data points from Business Central, like the invoice number, what the total amount is, what the company name is or the customer name is, and I can approve or reject it straight from my email. I don't even have to go into Business Central itself. And click submit. And I'm back in flow. This will refresh itself momentarily and then approve everything. And of course it fails because it's a demo. So I apologize for that. I think I may have missed, yes. I think I forgot to make my admin user super in this particular organization. So apologize for that. But it's trying to run this workflow right now. It unfortunately is not allowed to do that because I don't have the necessary permission. But if I did, it would have updated that particular record inside of Business Central. We can see that nothing has happened now, unfortunately. But this is a trial that I've just set up. I do think I forgot to configure my permissions properly. This is just one of the many flows that you could create. There are so many more scenarios that we could use as well. Let's take a look at that Power App that I showed earlier. So if I go over to Power Apps, that app I created earlier, that inventory app, let me open that up in the editor, and I'll show you how that is connected up. While this is loading, let me take a peek if there are any questions. No questions yet. We can see the app here in the app designer, which has the screens to the left here, and then the current screen we're looking at. We can see that in the middle here. If we go to the item screen, we can see that data is already being previewed live inside of this app. What we have here is a gallery component that I've dragged and dropped into this organization or into this canvas, which is connected up to the journals. So in the editor here, I can select which table I want to connect to. So I'm connecting to the journals here. I could also connect to the companies, for example, and then we'll get to pick which fields we want to use. So let's use display name and name and let's say the ID. So we can really connect dynamically to pretty much any table that we want. To add a gallery is fairly straightforward by going to insert and adding gallery. I'll pick a style and I can connect that up to a data source that I've already connected. So if I connect it to journals, it will just reset to what it looks like before. Let me change that into titles that actually make sense, maybe item description, and instead of using the E tag, we just use the amount, or actually let's use the quantity instead. And this data is all being pulled straight from Business Central without really any need of code, as you can see. I can connect any other data source as well by saying that I want to add a data source. And I want to connect to something else in Business Central, for example. I want to connect inside of my Cronus organization, and I'll just use a different table to connect. So let's say I want to connect to customers. I'll just use that connection instead. Now we're connected to the customer table. And you can already see the customer names being populated. Let me change some of those fields. So for the title, let's use the display name there. And for the subtitle, let's use the current balance. And then, well, for the image, they don't really have an image, but I can even change the layout of this once. It's currently using this layout. You can pick another one. I need some more titles, for example. And then when I click edit fields, I get to edit even more fields. For example, their phone number, which is empty in a lot of them. To say their balance, if we want to add their address. And if they have a logo uploaded or something, I can select that as well. So it's fairly easy for me to just drag a gallery inside of this app, connect it up to a Business Central source, and give this app to my users. And if they open it up on their phone, they'll sign into their Business Central account, and it will use that connection that we already have to pull that data from Business Central on their behalf. And they can just use this on their phone rather than dragging around their laptop into the warehouse or wherever they might be. For more advanced scenarios, if we cannot work with one of the standard tables that are available for us inside of the standard Business Central or standard NAV connector, we could also create our own custom connectors, especially when we want to connect to things that Microsoft has not yet turned on in the Business Central connector. For example, those physical inventory journals, that's not a standard table that we have just yet. At some point, Microsoft might turn that one on for us in the Business Central connector, but it's not there yet. Or maybe we have a requirement for a custom table that we added. Of course, that will also not be inside of the standard Business Central connector. So for that, we can create our own custom connector, which we can then use inside of Flow and inside of our Power App as well. So a custom connector is essentially just a wrapper around an API call. So if you've ever tried to connect to the standard NAV or Business Central web services, you know how that works, where you create a GET request or a POST request to pull data from NAV or Business Central or to push data into it. We can do those same things, but we'll predefine them in a readable format so that we can consume them later inside of Power Apps and Flow. And we can do that with both triggers and actions. although defining a trigger is slightly more complicated than an action. I'll go ahead and show you some actions. You can connect the existing web services that are enabled by default, and of course you can also connect the web services that you are enabling later on. Let's take a look at that, how it works, how to set it up, and how to use it. Let's start with how to use it, because I've already set up a few of those. Let me leave this editor and let's go into our flow. I'm going to go back to flows, and I have a slightly more advanced flow here, for example, which pushes updated BC products to CE, so from Business Central to customer engagement. Let's look at that one. And what it does here is it uses a recurrence pattern. So once a day, it will get items with updated pricing. But this is not a standard connector. This is a custom connector that I've configured myself. So we have very similar information in here. So I get to pick company name, for example. I also have to specify which tenant I'm using. And here I'll just search the items table for any product that has been modified since a few days. So I've configured an expression here that looks for items that have been modified in the last 7 days. You can see a very similar syntax here to how formulas in Excel work. Some of the phrases that you use inside of these expressions are a little bit different from Excel, but once you get the hang of them, you'll find that they are very similar. So it's pulling this list of items from Business Central, then it's gathering a few default properties that I need inside of sales. So there's primarily just IDs of objects that I want to connect to. And then it has found all of those items. Now for each, it will apply the following actions. It will find the corresponding product inside of customer engagement. And if it doesn't find that product, it will create it for me. And if it already exists, it will just do nothing for me. We'll look for that product inside of customer engagement using that number that we pull from Business Central. So that's just the product number inside of Business Central, and we'll match that to the product number inside of customer engagement. If it doesn't exist yet, we'll create it. The next item is to find the default price inside of customer engagement, and the same applies here. If it doesn't exist yet, we'll create it. But this time, if it does exist, we'll just update it. And we'll use the price that we pull from Business Central. So we'll use the unit price that we find on the product inside of Business Central. Every time this flow gets triggered, it will pull this information from Business Central and it will effectively synchronize it into customer engagement. If we look at the last time that ran, you can see the, apparently not. Sometimes this demo environment is a little bit finicky. There we go. Sometimes all it takes is a good refresh. So we can see it last ran about 12 minutes ago. So let's see what it did. It ran successfully and it applied all of these steps. So it got the items with updated pricing. We can see which items it pulled from Business Central. Then for each of those items, it applied these steps. So we can see that it's 1 of 20. So I can walk through each of these products to see what happened. So for this one, it looked inside of customer engagement if it could find that product. So what it did is it looks for a product with this number. And if it finds it, let's see if it found it. It did. We can see here, product does not yet exist in customer engagement, which is false. So it's no. So it doesn't have to do anything. It skipped these 2 steps. And we can see if it finds the default price. And did it? It did find the default price. So it focused on this step and skipped this one. And it updated the price. So the new price is now 55.2 inside of customer engagement, which is pulled directly from Business Central. So we look inside of customer engagement. If we go to our product catalog there, go to our product catalog, no, not this one, but this one. we'll see those very same products that we have inside of Business Central, and they all have the same prices as well as in Business Central. So we can see, go over to the price, see it has that same price, 1005.80. We go over to Business Central, and we open up the items. You can see those same items in here, and this one indeed, that table is 1005.80. And if I were to change that, it will also automatically update that inside of customer engagement. So let's say I'll make that just 1100 even. Go, wait for that to save. And then because I don't want to wait an entire day, I'll just run this flow right now. So in the edit mode, I'll just click on test, and I'll say I'll perform the trigger action. And because this is a recurrence, I don't have to perform the trigger action. It just means that it will run immediately. And we can see that happening live now. So we can see it's running right now. Open that one up. And see its progress. You can see it went through all of these steps already. We go over here, you can see those same 20 products. So it didn't just pick up that one, but that's because I'm looking back for 7 days. So all of the changes over the last 7 days, it's going to update all of those changes in one go. And once that has completed, we'll be able to see it's completed. We'll be able to see that this price, let me refresh that, has now changed to 1100. So now instead of relying on the standard integration between Business Central and customer engagement, I've created a on-demand integration that works exactly the way I needed to. It works on the schedule that I needed to work on, and I can define a whole bunch of additional information here as well. This is a very basic layout. I can devise all sorts of additional properties, especially when creating the products inside of customer engagement. For example, I want to specify more or less properties. Maybe I want to group them in a specific way inside of customer engagement versus how they are grouped inside of Business Central. I can really go in a lot of directions here. We can have another look at a different type of flow, which works the other way, which is pushing validated orders from customer engagement to Business Central. So here, instead of having a recurrence, we'll trigger on an event that happens inside of customer engagement, which is if an order is updated. We'll verify if that order is ready for financial. So check if the status is equal to financial, and if it's not, I'll immediately stop processing, which uses the terminate command. If it is, I'll collect the account from customer engagement, and I'll grab the order lines for the order as well. And then I'll look for that same customer inside of Business Central. So I'll look for the number where the account number is the same. And here I'll apply a very similar logic that we saw earlier. But here I'll check if that customer already exists in Business Central. And if it doesn't yet, I'll just create the customer inside of Business Central using the name and the account number, and there's a whole bunch of other details I haven't even specified yet, but it'll create that customer immediately and on demand straight in this process. And as soon as that's done, I'll go ahead and create the sales order itself, the header. And then for each of the order lines we found, we'll loop through those and we'll add on the correct item onto the sales order. We can see a small difference here between this icon and this icon, because this is my custom connector and this is a standard connector. So I can use all the different types of connectors, and whenever there is something that I would like to do and no standard connector exists, I can use a custom connector wherever I want. For example, there's no standard connector for finding an item inside of Business Central. So I just created my own connector here. And there's no standard connector to add a line item onto a sales order. There is just a generic one to create a sales order, but I cannot add any lines onto a sales order using the standard connector. So I defined my own connector for that. Let's look at those custom connectors. We go over here to custom connectors. This is where we define those. Let's take a look at the one I've already prepared. We start by giving them some general information like an icon, a color, a description, and then we define what we're connecting to. So in the case of Business Central, it's always going to be api.businesscentral.dynamics.com and then slash v1.0 slash, which is the basic URL for all of the API connections. Then I'll specify how do we connect to Business Central. Well, in Business Central, using a web service, we connect using that username and the web services key. And then we move on to the definitions of actions that I want to execute inside of either a flow or inside of a Power App. So a simple one, for example, is finding a customer, listing companies, finding items. All of these are actions that I've defined and I can then execute inside of my flows and Power Apps. So let's take a look at listing companies. We just define its name, and then we can see in the request what that looks like. So it'll request this URL where it's the api.businesscentral.com/v1.0. Then it will place the tenant ID in here, and then it will just access the OData4 feed and it will list companies. So this uses the standard API for Business Central and will then respond with a list of companies. We can test that out. So a list of companies. I can plug in a tenant ID here, and I'll have to grab the tenant ID for my organization here, which I know I have here. It's right here. There we go. I'll paste that in here, and it'll test it. And we can see the response that the Business Central API gives us is these company names. Now, because I've defined this inside of my custom connector, I can also use it in my flows. For find items, it's very similar. If we look at the definition of that, the request I provided here is also the OData4, but instead of just getting the list of companies here, I'll select the specific company, and then I'll touch the web service called native invoicing customers, which will give me a list of customers. And I can apply this to any of the web services inside of NAV, or Business Central. We take a look at the web services. Any of the web services that we have, I can turn any of those on. So all of them already turned on, I could create a custom connector for that straight away. But if any of them are not turned on, I can just add one, plug that URL into the custom connector, and it will work within minutes. Let me peek real quick if there's any questions. There's no questions so far. If there is any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. No one has done that so far.
I do monitor, Michelle, so I will let you know if there's any.
Okay, great. So now that we've seen some of the connectors that exist, let me plug in a new one. We can grab any web service that hasn't been turned on yet, or I can just grab one that's already turned on. Let's, for the ease of that, let's use that. So for example, let's grab the jobs, for example, if we want to get a list of jobs. If there's a lot of jobs in here right now, but I can grab the URL of the jobs here, which is this very long URL, but I can just grab this first part and go to my connector, add an action. So I'll just define get jobs. In operation ID, I'll just call that get jobs as well. I'll import a sample. I'll say this is a GET request, and the request looks like this. It's tenant ID and then /084, then the company name should be in here. I put these placeholders in here that will automatically turn into a question inside of the designer. I'll click import. Then you can see these two placeholders have automatically appeared. Then when I update the connector, we can go, once it's saved, to the test section, and then I'll click get jobs, and you can see that now it will ask me these two questions. So it'll ask me the tenant ID and the company name. So I'll just type that in manually and it'll test it. And we can see the response is this response right here. And we can use that to define the response itself. So if we go back to definition, I'll make sure to copy this response. So go ahead and copy that. Go back to the definition. And then for get jobs, I'll scroll down to the response section. Then I'll open the response and say import from sample for that as well. And I'll just paste that response inside of this body. Then I'll click import, which allows the platform to automatically detect all of those fields that are available. I'll click update connector again. And now if we go into a flow, and we start a very simple new flow. So I'll just go ahead and create from blank. I'll create a blank one. Start with a button, a very simple one. Try that again, button. Just a button that I click it and it starts running. I'll click new, and over on the custom tab, I can now see my custom connector. And we can see that the get jobs, oh, it's not in here yet. That sometimes takes a minute, so I was too fast. Jobs is in here. Let's click update again. This again. So let me just start again. Right from blank again. I'll use a button. And I'll add a new step. Use a custom step. And it's still not in here. That's very odd. It's very unusual. Usually it doesn't take this long. It can sometimes take a few minutes, so I don't want to take up too much of time here. Your custom connector will then automatically appear in here and also allow you to pull those items from the system as well. So that's why you define these output parameters to make sure that inside of flow in the next step. So if we take find customer, for example, you can see that tenant ID and company name in here. Those are two items that I've defined for that step. So if we go over here to find customer, you can see the request that I've defined in here is you need to specify the company name and the tenant ID, which I've done here. And you can also define a filter to search for the customer. It's also a property I added here. So we can add the tenant ID and the company name. And for the oops, that's not it. The tenant ID is this ID, and for the company name, I've defined that there is this drop down which we can use to just select the appropriate company name. And here we can just enter that search query against the API. And after we do that, we can start with an email. I'll go ahead and send email, for example. And if we look here in this dynamic content, we have that find customer step, and we can see all of those fields that are defined in the response for find customer, which is also what I have defined in my custom connector. So if we go over to find customers, you can see the response here. You can see all of those fields that I added based on one of those samples. So I can pull in any of those fields because I know that Business Central will always return those fields, so I can use them in any of my other steps. So I can send them an email. I don't really have an email address field, I think, filled in my organization, but I could just pop this in here, create a little welcome email here. Welcome. Pop in any of those fields. Or your order, even though it's not an order. So now when I click this button, it will automatically use my custom connector to get a list of customers, and then it will use this apply to each. So each of these actions inside here will be applied to each of my customers. So we saw several scenarios here to use Microsoft Flow or Power Apps to connect to Business Central or to NAV using either the standard connectors or the custom connectors. When you want to use the standard connectors, you can do that as well in any of the scenarios. Just search for Business Central or NAV. And when you do that, you can see all of these standard connectors, although the Business Central connectors are primarily still in preview. Which brings me to my Q&A slide. So if there are any questions, this will be a great time to ask them. If you want to see something specific, we can also walk through a specific scenario that you might already have in mind. So let me know.
Yes, Javier, we're going to send out the recording to all participants. Okay, so if there's no questions for Michelle, can I ask you to just answer this quick poll? We do want to touch on the topics on these webinars that you find the most interesting, so why not just ask you here? I thought so. Could you please just give your vote?
I see one question in the chat. If we could share some basic ideas on the licensing model. Can you be more specific? The basic idea behind the licensing model is that you use the existing licenses. So if you use a custom connector, you will always connect with a user you already have. You don't need to purchase any standard or separate licenses for that. So as long as you have at least one Business Central user, you can use a custom Business Central connector or a standard one.
Okay. We also had a recording from last week on Arjen's walkthrough on some licensing, but I guess those were not the same licensing topics.
Probably, I think they were more on the customer engagement side, not so much on Business Central side.
Was. Okay. Then I guess thank you very much, Michelle. Very informative, very technical. You lost me totally, so but I'm glad that everybody could follow along. So I will share the recording with all participants afterwards. And as I said, your slides are already available to you here in the attachment window, but those will obviously also be shared with you directly in an email. So thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon and evening.
Have a great day, everyone.
All right. Thank you. All bye.